It's been about a month since we've looked at how the world of theme parks and films are changing around us. We're moving into a period that I want to call the Great Experiment, a point where Disney, Universal, and others are beginning to aggressively reclaim territory once lost to the pandemic. This past week, for the first time since March 2020, all Disney parks around the globe were finally open at the same time. But this comes with a caveat. Out in Florida, there are many areas that are not back to normal. Entire resort areas such as Port Orleans remain closed at Disney World with no reopening date. Nearly all of the tours, small group experiences, and other enchanting extras are still on hiatus, and food service both at the California and Florida resorts remains a problem, in part because the resorts are simply having difficulty rehiring staff. During the long furlough, Disney lost a lot of hourly workers to other fields. For example, many theme park workers found new jobs in healthcare where there were many openings and greater job reliability. And some of those healthcare jobs also paid higher wages than theme parks. We're at a point where the CDC is reporting that, for the most part, vaccinated individuals should be able to enjoy many aspects of pre-pandemic life. In Florida, most health-related decisions are being left up to individual businesses. In California this past week, most pandemic precautions were being lifted as well, with few exceptions, such as public transportation, mass entertainment venues, and places where individuals might be uniquely at risk, including long-term care facilities and many indoor K-12 classrooms, as many school-age kids have not yet been able to be vaccinated. I should point out that California has again created new categories for health safety, with one category arranged around what it calls mega events, which includes theme parks. At the moment, venues in this category must confirm vaccination or negative COVID status for indoor events with over 5,000 people. This would mostly include concert and indoor sports venues. I'm guessing that the Anaheim Convention Center across the street from Disneyland in certain configurations may fall under this rubric, but there's nothing at Disney that does. And for outdoor events with 10,000 or more people, it is presently recommended that attendees confirm proof of vaccination or negative COVID status to attend. This is likely going to be the honor system for most California parks, with a box to check when purchasing tickets. But I point this out as it leaves open the possibility that if California adjusts the requirements for mega events, it will then reshape legal limits for theme parks. That is, California leaves open the possibility that a category of possibilities could affect theme parks that do not include smaller businesses. Without doubt, there's a movement back toward normal, but the world after the pandemic is going to be different than the world before the pandemic. In cinema, for example, people are starting to return to theaters, but a portion of the potential audience has now migrated over to streaming services. Also, there's an interesting cultural question moving through the world of film. For decades, movies with large budgets had the money to present sophisticated visual effects and hire top-level actors. For decades, TV didn't have the budget for either of these options. And then, in the early 2000s, when cable TV finally had the budget for top-level actors, they still didn't have the budget for sophisticated visual effects. That was a limitation for TV as a medium. Movies, on the other hand, were limited by venue. Very few people are willing to see a movie that is longer than a couple of hours, maybe 2.5 hours at most. For longer stories with sophisticated visual effects, production companies for decades essentially had the option of creating a franchise with a set of sequels. But with streaming services such as Disney+, we're starting to see the public explore narrative issues once constrained by venue. Streaming services can now afford both sophisticated visual effects and top actors. So the question now is this: is it more enjoyable to see a 2-hour story, perhaps with a sequel in a couple of years, Or is it more enjoyable to see a 6-hour or 10-hour story with one episode a week presented over a couple of months? Part of the audience is certainly expressing a preference for the depth and ongoing drama available in the 6 or 10-hour miniseries over the 2-hour film, especially when the levels of effects and acting are on par with those of traditional cinema. Technology often frames art and the possibilities for how it is produced. This is nothing new, but it's something that viewers often don't consider. For example, in the early 1800s, fiction in America was more focused on short stories than on novels. It was the golden age of the magazine, a publication form that was made possible by relatively new steam-powered printing presses. You can't have magazines with the old-style Gutenberg hand press, at least not mass-produced, cost-effective magazines. But as printing technology improved, and as readers gained greater familiarity with printed fiction, the center point of fiction began to shift from short stories to novels, a process that happened over decades. That is, a change in technology, along with lower cost of production, allowed the format of fiction to change as an art form. Readers preferred the character depth and plot sophistication in a novel over that of a short story. I think we're starting to see something similar take place today. The technology of streaming, along with a cost reduction in special effects, is creating the possibility of having true cinema-style entertainment presented at home, but with the added benefit of longer stories offered either in bingeable episodes, such as on Netflix, or on serialized weekly episodes, such as on Disney+. The change in technology and cost allows for a different format of visual storytelling than could be told 10 or 20 years ago. One of the issues being explored by the audience is one of comforts. Essentially, do you find the environment of a theater enjoyable or enticing? Also, how safe do you feel health-wise in a theater? But the other question has a lot more depth. Which is the more satisfying narrative experience? The 2-hour film that can be screened in a theater, or the 6-hour experience that is enjoyed at home with greater character exploration and story development and a wider range of subplots? So the question here may be now this. Now that acting and effects are similar between the small and big screen, which technology offers the most satisfying narrative experience? That's one underlying question circulating in the world of Disney right now. But for the most part on today's episode, we're going to explore how the American parks over the past month are trying to capitalize on the road back to normal. We're not yet at a point where we're back to normal, and the new normal is certainly going to be different than the pre-pandemic normal. But we are starting to see how quickly we may or may not be back to a world that is filled with familiar experiences. But before we get to our update, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. These are the people who make this podcast possible. Without the generosity of our subscribers, we simply wouldn't exist. These are the people who keep this podcast going. I'm grateful for each and every one of them. So this week, notes of gratitude are going out to recent subscribers Jason M., Jason L., Rebecca, Paul W., and David. And now, the show. Inasmuch as the pandemic came down around us with a quick fury, accompanied by public and business restrictions, those restrictions are now nearly as quickly being lifted. The CDC has said that vaccinated individuals can return to many pre-pandemic activities. In terms of a practical baseline, that creates a science-focused path for forward movement. But I believe it's also important to acknowledge that some individuals, even if vaccinated, will take months before they arrive at a sense of comfort about some of these activities. Or put it this way, Those who have gone to work throughout the pandemic may have less hesitancy and anxiety about returning to a more normal life than those who stayed mostly at home for the past year. Social customs are also at this unique midway point. Again, I should point out that I'm in California. During the height of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time at home, but since the level of infection has subsided, I've been to stores, I've been to the dentist, I've traveled out of state, and I've been to theme parks many times, in part to understand how their culture is changing. But even when I see close friends now, we tend not to hug or shake hands, at least not yet. There's still that lingering unease from the pandemic, the experience that we've all gone through in terms of length and how deeply it affected social customs was likely the largest nationally shared cultural event since World War II. Movement out of it simply will take time. In terms of hard science, the level of health safety has improved significantly in the last 4 months. But in terms of psychology, essentially in terms of people finding comfort in familiar patterns, it may take some people a while to adjust to new conditions. The first wave of change to the American parks came when Disney simply opened them, with some restaurants and experiences slowly coming online over the weeks that followed. Let's call this the mid-pandemic experience. For Florida, this started last July. For California, this past April. The sign that the Disney parks were positioning themselves for a second wave of change also started this past April. And this is not a full return to normal, at least not yet, but let's call this second phase, the late pandemic model. And there may be certain limits and mitigating factors in terms of moving forward quickly, such as highly transmissible variants, which includes the Delta variant. From my standpoint, I believe most indicators suggest that we'll have a far more comfortable summer this year compared to the one filled with pockets of anxiety last summer. If you want to travel somewhere, in my opinion, now is a very good time to do that in terms of risk levels. California has created a new policy category for mega events that can be used in the future to limit activities at theme parks, but I think most signs suggest that summer at least will present many familiar experiences at the parks on both coasts. The future concerns, as I see them, are the possibility that COVID, like the flu, will have an aspect of seasonality. Essentially, that winter months may bring higher levels of infection as they did last year. The high points of infection last year were between November and February, and with the vaccine we will likely see far lower levels of infection this winter, but there could be a seasonal uptick over those months. And the other area of concern is this: the possibility that some new variants may be vaccine resistant. So far, the vaccines, particularly the 2-dose vaccines, have provided strong protections against COVID variants. One good sign: after the Memorial Day weekend this year, in clear contrast to last year, there was not a significant spike in infection rates. But variants remain a wild card in the months moving forward. Executives overseeing large theme parks for the past 2 months have viewed the current moment in terms of risks and costs as being the time to make a reasonable gamble, to shift away from a mid-pandemic model to a late pandemic model. Disney World has removed social distancing markers in queues and ride areas, as well as from the boats. They've taken down signage about masks and social distancing. They've also removed physical barriers. They've uninstalled barriers in the Florida monorails. They've unbolted plexiglass from ride vehicles on Rise of the Resistance at Hollywood Studios. They've removed the screens separating parties on the Jungle Cruise boats, as well as similar dividers on other attractions. Some barriers remain in effect, such as those separating the skippers from traveling parties on the Jungle Cruise, but the majority of barriers have either come down or are coming down in future weeks. And this is a gamble. Unlike masking, which requires only signage, online language, and audio announcements to be turned back on again if COVID numbers rise next winter, the physical elements at the parks and on the attractions will need to be reinstalled if conditions months from now again worsen. The gamble here is that health-wise, we're at a point where the pandemic can be managed outside of physical distance and barriers. The early signs of this plan began to emerge in April, when both Universal and Disney posted job openings in Florida, particularly for attractions, custodial, quick-service foods, and merchandise. This was in preparation to increase capacity. To increase capacity, resorts need to hire and train staff. But in this, Disney and Universal were also quietly defining what would quickly become one of the biggest limitations in creating a late pandemic model. After a lengthy furlough, the resorts no longer had access to a deep pool of entry-level labor. This was particularly true for Disney, as they had also turned off their college program, whose participants filled many entry-level jobs. In terms of first-hand experience, the limitations related to labor are most likely to be felt by guests in terms of food service. Reduced kitchen help means a continuation of limited menus. Reduced wait staff means limited seating and perhaps slower service as well. Simply, individuals in some of these jobs over the furlough found work elsewhere, changed careers, and may be hesitant to return to dense public environments such as at a theme park. What some ex-cast members discovered was that other industries not only paid better, but offered greater job security. This will be a central, if not the central issue for the Disney resorts in the U.S. for the rest of 2021. In anticipation of higher visitation, Disney World is now trying to open more resort areas, particularly hotel areas, which are a profit center. Though the DVC rooms in some resort areas have been open for a year, the related cash rooms, or hotel rooms for general visitors at those same resorts, have been closed since March 2020. These include Beach Club, which just reopened on May 30th, Wilderness Lodge, which also just reopened June 6th, Boardwalk Inn, which will reopen on July 2nd, The Poly, which should open late July or early August, based on a yet-to-be-determined final construction schedule, and Jambo House, which now has an August 26th reopening date. These are all deluxe resorts. As the DVC areas in these resorts have been open for a year, lobby areas in some, though far from all of the resort restaurants, have remained open during this time. Disney's also used the pandemic to update some rooms, such as adding a Moana theme to rooms at the Poly and to update art and sleeping areas at Wilderness Lodge. But members of the resort team have told me repeatedly that reservations continue to be down at the deluxe hotels, even at signature resorts such as the Grand Floridian, while reservation levels for moderate and value resorts are up, significantly so. Think of it this way. Though families are returning to the resort, few of them are eyeing this summer as the time to purchase a top-level resort vacation, especially as some resort activities are still on hiatus. There is far more demand right now for value and moderate resorts, though in terms of labor, the deluxe resorts may be easier to open as the staff has already opened many common areas such as the lobby, pools, and restaurants to accommodate DVC members. My hunch is that over summer and fall, Disney will offer discounts for deluxe resorts as a way of shifting up those interested in a moderate room into a deluxe as there's more availability there. And beyond these hotels, there are still a number of resorts that have no reopening date whatsoever. Both halves of the Port Orleans remain closed, and 2 of the 3 All-Stars remain closed. In all, that's about 7,500 hotel rooms that remain closed with no reopening plan, or roughly 20% of the rooms at the resort. At this point, the summer season has already started, and as most families plan months out for a Disney vacation, Disney likely has a good sense concerning resort visitation for July and August. But depending on actual visitation over summer and forecast for reservations, Disney may target October or November as the next point where more areas of the resort can open, as a way of preparing for a fuller holiday season, assuming they can staff the positions. To reopen, Port Orleans will require significant hiring. At this point, the college program, depending on the number of participants, may help cover some of the shifts necessary for a greater resort opening. On May 3rd, Disney announced that they would restart the college program, beginning with those whose program ended early or was canceled due to the pandemic. The college program was a division started decades ago by Dick Nunes, in part to create a flexible labor pool with college students who were excited to work entry-level jobs such as food service and attractions, as well as some skilled jobs such as lifeguards. The people in the program were presented with concepts of the Disney culture. The best participants in those groups could be invited back for full-time jobs or possibly directed at professional internships in design, culinary, business, etc. at the resort. At least before the pandemic, part-time cast members typically started at $13 an hour. Full-time cast members started at $14 an hour, while members of the college program typically started at $11 per hour. And as they were part-time, they never advanced to the point where Disney paid benefits. Students received work experience with the Disney seal of approval, and Disney had a large pool of flex labor, filling in shifts that were often in less desirable time slots. How large was this pool? Well, typically between 4,000 and 5,000 students per semester. In other words, a lot. This program, after a year's hiatus, began to come back online this past week, with a few students moving into the new Flamingo Crossing complex, and will expand out in the fall and likely be a tool that allows Disney to move beyond their current park hours and other offerings. But even with this optimistic outlook, and putting aside any subsequent complications related to COVID next winter, there's other barriers for the Florida resort, as opposed to the California resort, which is more targeted at regional visitation. The Florida resort is arranged in part for international visitors, and even as domestic travel picks up over summer, international travel will be depressed for months, and for some regions, unavailable due to travel restrictions. So far, at Disney World, we're at a new plateau in terms of a return to a full range of experiences. But we're not yet back to a resort that is completely open with a complete range of offerings. In Florida, annual passes are still not available for new purchase. Park hopping only happens after 2 p.m. Hotels have modified housekeeping schedules due to COVID. Typhoon Lagoon remains closed with no reopening date. There are no fast passes, no parades, no character meet and greets. A lower level of outdoor entertainment in the parks gives some areas, particularly at Epcot and Animal Kingdom, a lower sense of vitality, and the dining plan still hasn't come back online, which is related at least in part to the labor shortage we discussed. We'll talk about some of these issues, particularly what's likely to come back online this fall, later in this episode. But at this point, let's shift over to masks, what is and what is no longer required, as both American resorts still have some limited mask requirements. So the hot button topic of the season is masks, and there's a lot of movement here. Disney World is ending mask requirements in stages. First, it was for photos, then for outdoor locations. Universal Orlando was the first to drop mask requirements for indoor spaces, which was followed 2 weeks later by Disney in Florida, reducing mask requirements for most indoor areas. Disney World removed most of their remaining mask requirements on June 15th, on the same day that Disneyland removed nearly all mask requirements at their resort. The language at Disneyland and Disney World further shifts the burden of health responsibility from the resort to mandate and require masks to the guests. The language for the California resort says that unvaccinated guests must continue to wear masks except when dining. The resort itself won't check for vaccination verification, though guests will likely need to attest to this when purchasing tickets. In Florida, it's illegal following the governor's orders for a business to ask about a person's vaccination status. And in California, no cast members are doing this in practice. To start with, these policies give both resorts some degree of legal coverage, as they are essentially following CDC and state guidance, but also the shift in mask requirements corresponds to a shift in potential damage. Before widespread vaccination, all guests were equally at risk for infection. But after widespread vaccination, there's a much greater risk burden absorbed by a few groups: those with medical concerns such as chemotherapy who cannot receive the vaccine, those under 12, and those who choose not to receive the vaccine. I think these new rules will work better overall once vaccine options open for younger kids, and some families with kids under 12 may be upset with the change presently in policy, particularly in Florida, where it can be difficult to modify or cancel all aspects of a vacation. But presently the shift in responsibility is a trade in which vaccinated adults have some, albeit minimal, risk in exchange for the opportunity to enjoy the parks without a mask, while other groups absorb a higher level of risk. During the time that the California resort has been open, I've seen clear movement in this direction. On April 30th, the day Disneyland reopened, I picked a random bench and observed the mask habits of the first 300 people who passed. Compliance was amazingly high. 297 of those I saw were wearing masks in line with Disney's policies. 2 weeks later, I did the exact same thing. I took a bench by the Matterhorn and counted off the first 300 people who walked by. This time, it wasn't 3. But 31 people out of those 300 who weren't wearing masks in accordance with Disney's policies, and in a number of cases weren't wearing masks at all. I felt the variance was so wide that after reflecting on this, I waited until it was cooler during the evening and then counted people again. This time it wasn't 31, it was 30 out of 300 who weren't wearing masks in line with policies. In those 2 weeks after opening, there was a clear shift in public sentiment and policy enforcement. When I returned to the resort in early June, I saw similar levels of compliance which paved the way for the removal of this policy. In early May, I saw guests removed from the park for mask-related issues, but by early June, at least in my personal experience, I saw none of that. The one area at both resorts where masks are still required is on transportation, again mimicking public policies. Only there's a lot more transportation at Disney World than at Disneyland. For months moving forward, you'll likely need to have a mask in your pocket at Disney World, as they will be required on most transportation, which includes buses, monorails, and the Skyliner. Transportation that has open areas for ventilation, such as the ferries, won't require masks. But for me, it's a very rare visit to Disney World where I don't find myself on a bus, monorail, or the Skyliner at some point during my day. In California, masks will be required on the parking lot trams. At the moment, the plan is to continue the long walk from Mickey and Friends over to the parks, but starting on June 18th, Disney also opened the Toy Story lot, which offers a tram. Masks will be required on that tram, and likely on other trams if they reopen later this summer. Again, we aren't back to normal, though we're moving in that direction. We're still in a transitional phase, moving out of the pandemic. Until recently, parks on both coasts created situations in which health safety was managed through physical distancing, physical barriers, capacity restrictions, spaced ride vehicle loading, and mask requirements. Many of these elements are going away, again as a type of transition toward more normal park experiences. But in this, I think it's helpful for guests to match the current park environments with their current comfort levels and to have realistic expectations for how the parks are operating. At this point, I've been vaccinated for months. Speaking from my own experience, I felt comfortable at the parks. But here are some observations that may help you gauge your own comfort level. Without queue markers, lines crowd and bunch up more than they did with markers. Most people out of habit will leave a little space between traveling groups, and most people are generally courteous. If you ask a group to leave you a little space, most groups typically will. Most rides at Disneyland and Disney World are now mixing traveling groups into the same ride vehicle. On some rides, there's a chance that you'll be seated next to a stranger, just like before the pandemic. The majority of guests do not wear masks, except when on transportation systems. There are guests who do wear masks all day, and so if you choose to wear a mask, you should feel perfectly at home. And there are some guests who put on masks when they go inside. Most kids, clearly under 12, do not wear masks. In Florida, no cast members are allowed to ask about their vaccination status per the governor's orders, and in California, again in practice, no cast members will ask as well. In recent weeks, there has been a significant shift in mask behavior at the parks, a shift that coincides with a significant reduction in new cases, particularly in California, and rising numbers of vaccinated adults. Though Disney has stopped discussing the granular increases to capacity, based on a number of statements by executives, I believe it's clear that the parks are somewhere around 35 to 40% of capacity right now, perhaps a little higher in Florida, and as more cast members are hired, the parks will increase capacity numbers into fall, likely with the goal of having 2 American resorts that are able to handle seasonal crowds over winter. I think that this generally lays out the pros and cons of summer visitation. I think most people will feel comfortable, with the exception of those with underlying medical concerns that may make them more vulnerable to infection. And if you're on the fence, I might point out that there are ways to focus a visit to a Disney park, particularly Disneyland in California and the Magic Kingdom in Florida, so that your day is mostly focused on outdoor experiences. For example, the steam trains, the riverboats, Autopia, or depending on your coast, the Tomorrowland Speedway, the People Mover, Dumbo's Flying Elephants, the Carousel, and so on. And if crowds are still a point of concern for you, remember, midweek days in September are historically low visitation periods for all of the American parks. After 15 months of a worldwide pandemic, we're coming out of this with our own individual comfort levels, which seems perfectly normal. My level of comfort may not be right for you, and someone else's level of comfort may not be right for me. And if this description of the parks as they presently operate doesn't match your own comfort level, don't worry about it. We're still in a cycle of the pandemic, the late pandemic model. Beyond this, in a few months or maybe a year, we'll hopefully be moving into a post-pandemic model when the risk levels will go down even more. But at this point, the expansion of vaccine distribution, 300,000 doses so far in the States, has created a path toward park policies that allow for more freedom. Despite months of rumors about Fantasmic being the first nighttime spectacular to return to the Florida resort, on July 1st, Disney will return to nighttime shows, but not with Fantasmic. Instead, with Happily Ever After at the Magic Kingdom and Epcot Forever around World Showcase Lagoon. In this, there's a few things to unpack. Hollywood Studios, which hosts Fantasmic, would benefit more from a driver to keep people in the park during evening hours, but Fantasmic offers little ability for guests who choose to do so to keep some distance from others. At this point, social distance is a personal choice, not a requirement. The arena for Fantasmic is a mass entertainment venue with stadium seating. The show exit is a wave of people muscling out small passageways. This may have played into the decision to move Fantasmic into a rehab while leaving the possibility for nighttime shows in other parks. Happily Ever After over at the Magic Kingdom can be viewed in high-density areas such as the Castle Forecourt and low-density areas such as by Rivers of America. It can also be viewed around Seven Seas Lagoon and Bay Lake. It allows visitors a range of choice in terms of crowd options. Likewise, Epcot Forever has a wide viewing area around World Showcase Lagoon. And on a practical note, this end-of-the-night show is the lure to drive dinner sales at dozens of restaurants in the park. No park at Disney World has as deep an investment in restaurants and evening dining as Epcot. Fantasmic, as opposed to these other two shows, also has a very high entertainment cost, as it is essentially a stage show with dozens of performers and a full effects lighting and sound crew. So the decision to pivot to fireworks shows with minimal entertainment costs may have been largely financial, especially if Disney has corporate sponsors to underwrite the cost of the pyro. Pandora was the corporate sponsor for the Wishes fireworks show and later Happily Ever After from 2014 up until the start of the pandemic. At this point, I'm unsure if they're still sponsoring the show when it reopens, but I suspect that's likely. In bringing back fireworks before parades, I see three advantages. First, nighttime entertainment encourages people to stay later at the parks. The longer people stay, the more they spend there, which may mean the difference between dinner on property and dinner off property. Second, as alluded to earlier, fireworks can be enjoyed at distance, particularly at the Magic Kingdom. Parades can only be viewed fully in the thick of the crowd. And so for those guests who might still have some hesitancy or latent anxiety about crowds, fireworks offer more comfortable ways to enjoy the spectacle. And lastly, Disney has kept a portion of its pyro team on salary during the pandemic. I don't think the resort will wire up the extended loop around the Magic Kingdom anytime soon. But the full pyro team before the pandemic handled Happily Ever After, Epcot Forever, preparations for Harmonious, Fantasmic, the Galactic Spectacle at Hollywood Studios, some of the fire effects for Rivers of Light at Animal Kingdom, as well as some smaller shows. The reduced pyro team, perhaps with some minimal hiring, can likely handle the two shows and continue testing for Harmonious versus the hundreds of additional hires necessary to convert cavalcades into parades. That is, there was likely a labor cost equation in this process as well. Lastly, the announcement of Epcot Forever likely signals that Harmonious won't premiere for months. There will be an announcement and some advertising leading up to its premiere at one point months ago. I was hopeful that Harmonious would premiere with the October 1st events for the 50th, but with this I'm now less optimistic. To resurrect Epcot Forever at this point probably means that they will run it for more than just a couple of months. Also, Ratatouille has already been announced for October 1st. Disney, I'm guessing, will benefit more from a steady stream of premieres trickled out over many months in which the press can focus on each new edition. And though by the time we get to fall, maybe there'll be a tag for the 50th anniversary at the end of one or both fireworks shows, for the summer, the plan is to present standard shows without any holiday editions for July 4th. But entertainment is beginning to return in small ways. During the past week after hours, for the first time in 15 months, the Disneyland Band in California began to practice marching down Main Street. Though dressed in shorts and jeans for this rehearsal, with the trombones leading the band, the group performed to the third shift workers after the park closed to guests. They were preparing to perform for the first time in over a year to actual guests, which happened on June 18th, shortly after the park opened with fewer limitations. So where are we in terms of the road back, and how will the fall look different than summer? I think the Halloween after-hours event at the Florida resort is the perfect metaphor for where we are in this late pandemic moment. Last year, there was no after-hours hard-ticket Halloween event in Florida. This year, the park won't host the full Mickey's Not So Scary as it has before the pandemic for decades. Instead, the resort has found some middle ground. It's offering a smaller event without the full parade and various shows. It's called the Boo Bash, is classified as an after-hours event as opposed to a seasonal party, and will include some of the elements or modified elements from Mickey's Not So Scary. It won't have the parade, but it will have Halloween-themed cavalcades. It won't have character greetings, but it will have character sightings. It won't have the Hocus Pocus stage show, but it will have the Cadaver Dance, holiday decor, along with seasonal lighting and treat stops with candy. The event at which this was announced was called Halfway to Halloween, which officially meant that in terms of the calendar year, we were then halfway to Halloween. But also, I think, in terms of metaphors and the quest for pre-pandemic normalcy, we are roughly halfway to those Halloween experiences we lost back in 2020. Though at the Florida resort, many pre-pandemic experiences have now come back online, many are still waiting over in the wings. If I had to pick the next two areas that would come back online, I would pick Fast Pass and the dining plan, as decisions will likely be driven more by financial realities than by aesthetics. There are some interconnected elements that all need to be in play here to bring these experiences back, but I think we're on the road to accomplishing this. As the parks increase capacity, a system like Fast Pass will be necessary to manage guest satisfaction. Guests typically aren't happy if they experience fewer than 8 attractions, and without Fast Pass or a similar virtual queue system, it's difficult to do that in a crowded park. Also, guests who spend their entire day waiting in lines don't spend free time between attractions purchasing food and souvenirs. Long lines are neither good for guest satisfaction nor the resort's bottom line. As more restaurants open and are fully staffed, Disney will want to maximize the profit from them. Simply, if guests are standing in line all day, they will have less time for meals and browsing in stores. So I expect to see FastPass or some FastPass replacement, such as virtual queues, appear in the parks in the near future, perhaps in fall as a way of testing the system before the winter holidays. In other episodes, we've broken down the financial structure of the Disney dining plan. This is a profit center for Disney. During the mid-pandemic period, the largest barrier to the dining plan was social distancing, essentially empty tables to create distance between traveling groups in restaurants. With physical distancing, there wasn't enough availability to ensure that guests on the plan would have access to the restaurants. Now the main barrier is labor. In Central Florida, many restaurants, including some third-party restaurants on Disney property, are offering hiring bonuses to employees who sign on to work in the kitchen or as waitstaff. On May 27th, Universal announced that they, in attempting to quickly hire another 2,000 team members, would raise starting pay from $13 an hour to $15 an hour to attract new applicants, a pay structure that also gives them an edge over Disney, at least until October, when Disney also, according to a 2018 announcement, planned to reach $15 an hour as a starting wage. Existing hourly team members at Universal will also see increased pay in their checks starting late in June. For the near future, perhaps when hiring is most important, this gives Universal an edge to attract employees from a diminished pool of potential workers. And this is a centerpiece issue in Florida at the moment. The depletion of available labor, or rather the shift of labor from theme parks to what might be perceived as more reliable centers of employment such as healthcare, has made it very difficult for Disney to open its restaurants to a point where it can restart the dining plan. Again, the reinstatement of the college program with a base of thousands of part-time employees, will help staff restaurants, which will then create the financial possibility that not only FastPass will be a priority for the resort, but that the dining plan will be able to be re-engaged as well. I don't expect either of these programs to come online in the next month or two, but rather as likely additions in fall as the resort moves towards the holiday season. Much of what we've discussed so far has been focused on Florida, but there's movement in California as well. In 3 recent episodes, we've already explored the new land at DCA Avengers Campus, so here I want to focus on other changes. In the past weeks, Disneyland has been noticeably more crowded, with reservations on many dates booked for both parks. Disneyland is a regional resort that draws the majority of its visitors from Southern California and neighboring states, particularly Arizona. As the health situation improves, the visitor base for Disneyland has the potential to react more quickly than the visitor base for Disney World. Most visitors to Disney World fly in and book hotels for many days, which requires planning, whereas most visitors to Disneyland simply drive in, spend at most a day or two in a hotel, then leave. This requires a park reservation and maybe a hotel room. A short family trip to Disneyland can be far more spontaneous than a typical trip to Disney World. When Disneyland lifted the mask requirement, the resort faced many of the labor issues encountered at the Florida resort. At that time, over 20 attractions remained closed. Perhaps more seriously, over 20 food service areas remained closed at the resort as well. 6 of these, including Oga's Cantina, were reopened on June 17th. A handful of others, including Trader Sam's, are now scheduled to reopen in July. On the list with no reopening dates are some noticeable absences, such as the Hungry Bear restaurant, which has a large outdoor seating area that might be particularly attractive to some families during this late pandemic period. But my guess is that the issue here pertains to available labor, particularly for entry-level jobs, such as counter service restaurants and merchandising. The lower tables at the Hungry Bear are open to the public, mostly for people bringing food there from other locations. Though I don't have hard numbers for the labor situation in Central Florida this week, I do have those numbers for Southern California. At this point, the majority of job sectors in California have rehired to reach over 90% of their pre-pandemic employment levels. Healthcare is at 99%, construction at 96%, business services at 94%, and government at 93%. But labor sectors related to tourism are still off their pre-pandemic highs. Hotels are at 65% of pre-pandemic employment. Entertainment and recreation is at 74%, and restaurants are at 81%. And these numbers are after significant hiring blitzes in May. These tourism and entertainment divisions account for 54% of Southern California's new hires or rehires over the last 4 months, essentially since the start of March, as vaccine distribution began to expand beyond the elderly and essential workers. At this point, with another 32,000 workers hired into Southern California's entertainment and tourism sectors last month, businesses are finding that there's no longer a deep pool of available labor. Some people previously tied to those areas have moved on to other jobs, such as in healthcare. Others went back to college or trade schools. Some are staying at home to help with kids, who in Southern California have likely had online classes for most, if not all, of the year, perhaps with the last few months arranged around some hybrid model in which kids attended school in person part-time. Some version of this labor shortage is playing out in a similar fashion in Florida, with the various resorts now vying for available labor with higher wages. As in Florida, the California resort hopes to move back to a larger range of experiences in stages. The resort plans to gradually increase capacity from 35% to 100%, or at least something close to that, over the next 4 or 5 months. Assuming health conditions remain stable, But the removal of physical distance and other pandemic policies has some noticeable secondary benefits focused on guests. With the ability to better fill ride vehicles, the virtual lottery for spaces on the new Spider-Man ride on June 15th anyways lasted 5 minutes instead of the usual 15 seconds. On opening weekend back at the start of this month, I clicked in at 1 second after 7 o'clock in the morning, had a reservation at 11 seconds after 7, and was in group 54 that didn't load until the afternoon. That mad rush now appears to be over. Likewise, queue areas, which in California previously needed to be staged fully outdoors, can now be moved to indoor space without social distance markers. This reduces outdoor queues in Fantasyland, Tomorrowland, and New Orleans Square, which on previous days presented lines of people snaking around trees, benches, and islands of strollers. One of the park's longest attractions, Rise of the Resistance, which had cut its opening show sequence, the Hologram of Rey, to move the attraction under the state-mandated 15-minute maximum, restored the Rey sequence so that the full attraction now operates as planned. Some other attractions with smaller theater-based indoor space, such as the Sleeping Beauty walkthrough and the Animation Academy, reopened, though other attractions such as Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln remain closed. Fireworks will return on July 4th, but it's the smaller and less expensive version of Disneyland's 2 pre-pandemic shows. Before the pandemic, Disneyland ran both Disneyland Forever during the summer and during the off-season, Mickey's Magical Mix. The Magical Mix had 2 versions, one that was mostly focused on lasers and projections, and one that blended those elements with fireworks over the castle, which was typically offered on weekends. Again, the projection-based elements encourage guests to view the show throughout the park, as the show offers projections both on Main Street and the Small World facade. If the phantasmic water screens are working on Rivers of America, projections can be featured there as well. Part of this may be a cost consideration. Magical Mix is almost surely less expensive than Disneyland Forever, but part of it may be an industrial engineering consideration, as Magical Mix encourages guests to disperse throughout the park rather than to gather only on Main Street. And so, in this, on both coasts, we are about halfway back to normal. We're at a late pandemic phase of theme park operations, and with fingers crossed on both hands, I'm hopeful that the situation will continue to improve as we slowly work toward fall. As I record this, it's Sunday morning, Father's Day. I try to record these updates as close to airtime as possible to include any last-minute changes to the parks, as changes have been happening on a daily basis in recent weeks. But I'm about to go inside and have a late breakfast with the kids. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode, and the plan, at least at the moment, is to post up the next episode in the life story of designer John Hench, as Walt Disney focuses in on his plans for Epcot the City, and Hench himself oversees design work on the new Tomorrowland. If you enjoy this podcast, if you find it meaningful or helpful, please support us by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. We are an ad-free, listener-supported show. The best reason to join is to support the research and work we do here. But on Bandcamp, you'll also find exclusive episodes that have never appeared on iTunes or elsewhere on the web. You can join at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.